Hi, everybody. Welcome to Common Narrative. I'm Crystal Haynes, and you know what we do here. Common Narrative examines the media's effect on public perception across all lines of diversities, and perhaps more importantly, we go behind the headlines and unpack the civic and social issues affecting your life. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was sentenced on Friday, as many of us know, to more than 2 decades in jail following his conviction for the 2020 murder of George Floyd. Chauvin was sentenced to 22 and a half years in prison, and prosecutors had asked for 30 years. Chauvin's attorney asked for probation and time served. Here with me to break all of this down, the emotion, the anger, the pain, and perhaps the feeling of justice, is Reverend Cornell Brooks, professor at the Harvard Kennedy School and director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice. He's also the former CEO and president of the NAACP. My first question, and I think so many folks are asking, is what was it like, following this verdict and then being in the space where it was happening?
It was both heartening and disappointing. Heartening in the sense of being a verdict, a sentence, but also disappointing in terms of the length of time. And what I mean by that is that the legitimacy of the Chauvin sentence has everything to do with rarity and severity. The rarity of an officer being charged, convicted, and sentenced, and the severity of the sentence itself having everything to do with its legitimacy. So if more police officers were charged and convicted, then people would not be looking with such anticipation and anxiety with respect to the severity of the sentence. But in this instance, where it is extremely rare, that is to say, in no more than 2% of cases do you see an officer charged and convicted. So we had this globally televised trial based upon a viralized video of a cold-blooded murder, and you get less than the maximum, right? So we are heartened by the fact that the Chauvin was charged, sentenced, and convicted at all, but disappointed that he didn't get the maximum. Particularly, we had 4 aggravating factors, one of which is the fact that the murder was committed literally in front of children. And when you look at previous convictions, one of the things that has tended to push judges to give the maximum is the fact that the crime involved children, as in a child victim, but in this case, it was an adult victim, but it took place in front of children. So, as I like to remind people, this says both what we as a country can do and what we should be doing. In other words, this is not all that could be done, but it says what we can do and what we should yet do.
Well, let me ask you this. It's right before the sentencing hearing, Chauvin's attorneys were trying to have a mistrial called. What do you think that says to where he was in terms of his remorseness for this particular crime? Because he had mentioned that he apologized to the family, or he was trying to apologize to the family after the verdict came down.
Well, I think much of what we saw in the sentencing on the part of defense counsel and even Derek Chauvin was what I would call the litigation of desperation, right? This is the lawyering of desperation. So the defense counsel essentially says, we want just parole before then, well, I should say probation before then. And then in the sentencing hearing, he essentially argues for the minimum of the sentencing guidelines allow, right? So this is basically desperation defense. Chauvin acknowledges in the most minimal way the presence of the Floyd family and essentially says that there's forthcoming information that will give you peace of mind. Now, his lawyers didn't suggest that, judge didn't suggest that, nobody else suggested that, but this was some desperate attempt to essentially say, I feel, if not feel, I at least acknowledge your pain. To me, it was completely disingenuous, completely insincere. You know, in some ways, it kind of reminded me of his best and worst character witness, his mother. Meaning his mother said to the judge, if you impose a lengthy sentence, you're not merely imposing a sentence on my son, Derek Chauvin, you're imposing a sentence on me. She was right. But it is also true that Derek Chauvin imposed a sentence on George Floyd. That is, he imposed a death penalty on George Floyd, and he also imposed a life sentence of suffering on the Floyd family, both of which were sentences rendered without a judge or jury. The mother got a sentence, but it's via a judge. George Floyd got a sentence and his family got a sentence, but without judge or jury or justice. And so his best character witness, if you will, essentially pointed to the degree to which their defense did in any way acknowledge the magnitude of the harm. I mean, little Gianna basically wishing that her daddy was around to help her brush her teeth, to take she said to take a plane trip, right? She when she was asked about what she wanted to do with the daddy in terms of playing, it was take a plane trip. It was almost a child's, you know, moral imagination. It was speculative. It wasn't all the things we've done in the past. It's like, what could we do? So it was just, you know, I just think unfortunate. And last point here, which was the defense counsel also said, we've briefed all the issues, so we're not going to focus that much on the law. And he then switches to what I would call a Trumpian post-Charlottesville, both sides argument. If you impose a lengthy sentence, people will be angry. If you impose a lenient sentence, people will be angry. So you should just impose a lenient sentence. And then he says to the judge that essentially that this case represents a cultural divide, right? So in other words, we've reduced a murder, a homicide, an instance of police brutality to a cultural prop, right? This is almost like rendering the body of George Floyd as critical race theory, or you know, any or Black Lives Matter, or any of the racial bogeymen that, you know, right-wing people, some, invoke to divide others. So I just thought it was a very strange, desperate, borderline demagogic defense argument.
What kind of effect do you think hearing these victim witness testimonies had on the community, you know, at large? We, for the last year and a half or more, have been experienced this trauma and pain of George Floyd's death. And then to hear it again and see that video of his daughter and to hear from his brothers and his family members, I mean, it had to have a profound effect.
Absolutely profound effect. And Crystal, your question really speaks to something that I think is undernoted, which is this. The victim impact statements had a profound effect and yet have a profound effect on the country, but did not have much of an impact on the judge, right? The judge comes out with a 20-page memorandum, legal memorandum already drafted. He hears these incredibly emotionally wrenching impact statements and comes back 15 minutes later with the decision. In other words, the decision was already written, the decision was already made. And then the judge also said, Peter Cahill also said that this decision was not based on emotion, not based on sympathy. I acknowledge your pain. Now, I simply want to note here, like, a judge need not say that in order for an opinion to have legal integrity, that it must be utterly divorced from sympathy, right? I was a little perplexed by that. But in terms of the impact of these statements on the country, this is profound. Why? My colleagues at the School of Public Health have done research which essentially says that when there's a police homicide, Black people in the surrounding jurisdiction feel the mental health impact destructively, deleteriously, for not moments, not days, but weeks and even months. My colleague at the Kennedy School, Desmond Ang, has done research which essentially says when Black children are essentially digital or actual witnesses to a police homicide, their grades suffer, absenteeism goes up, graduation rates go down, college attendance goes down. What is true for Black people in particular, I believe is true for many of us in general, which is to say these victim impact statements reflect the impact of the crime on the victims, but in some ways victimize the public. We vicariously feel the pain of this. I mean, who listening to Gianna talk about her daddy with a kind of moral simplicity and profundity and an innocence? In other words, she's not fully grasped. Like when she was asked about how she feel about missing her daddy, and she says, "But my daddy's with me." Right? She has been told that you've lost your daddy physically, but he's still with you. And so she's responding to the question with a child's psychological literalism. You told me something, I believe it, right? And later on, she's going to realize that her daddy isn't with her, but he is also with her. That both things are true. So this is, I think, profoundly impactful. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, let me put it this way. Our minds, our hearts, and our spirits have been hashtagged to death through this trial.
Yes.
Right? It's not that we're immediately reading the hashtag. We are being hashtagged.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I'm thinking about all of the changes that have come in the wake of George Floyd's murder. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the attention that it has gotten, the change that has happened within institutions, right? Mm-hmm. More change than we have seen in a very long time. Mm-hmm. But now that this trial, barring any other appeals and whatnot that may happen, do you think that change is lasting?
Well, I think that I'm reminded that Martin Luther King said that change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability. But I will simply say in this moment, the change is being pushed on wheels of our own volition. We choose to change the course of the society, meaning when last summer 26 million Americans across 550 jurisdictions took to the street in the George Floyd protests, millions more around the world, in the world's and the country's largest demonstration, both numerically and geographically, and also racially and ethnically, right? In other words, in the majority of those Black Lives Matter protests, the majority of people were not in fact Black, okay? So that represents a significant shift. Two, when we look at the legislation introduced around the country in terms of no-knock warrants, recognizing the tragedy of Breonna Taylor, and we look at the push to hold police officers accountable, the push to check qualified immunity, the push to get rid of police officers' Bill of Rights, which oftentimes represent not a Bill of Rights, but a bulletproof shield of accountability. So there's a tectonic shift going on in society. I believe it's not going to be a smooth road forward, right? In other words, we're seeing it right now. The rise in violent crime is causing some to say, we need to go back to a violent version of what we had before. We also see in many parts of our community, younger people saying, defund the police, older people saying we want more police and more visible policing. But I think everyone's saying we need to reimagine what we think the options are. And so I'm simply saying to you, I believe that nothing is guaranteed, but so many of us are working to ensure that things change profoundly. I mean, I have a class in which we worked with mayors locally in Somerville, Massachusetts, Birmingham, Alabama, Albany, New York, helping these mayors reimagine policing, thinking about how can we deploy police and use policing such that policing doesn't equal public safety. Police are part of public safety. And the analogy I use is this: if the CDC discovered a cancer cluster, we would not simply inundate that community with willy-nilly, with more nurses, more doctors, more medical establishment, more hospitals. We would try to find out the source of the cancer and send in more oncologists, send in environmental experts. Similarly with policing, if there's a rise in crime, you just don't just dump more police on the problem. That's a little like just dumping money or throwing money at a problem. We want to be thoughtful in terms of figuring out what elements can we use to bring about more public safety. So I think change is happening, change is coming. It's not inevitable, but I do believe that what Emmett Till represented to the civil rights movement, George Floyd represents to the Black Lives Matter movement today.
Well, let me ask you this. What effect has this trial had on policing across the country? Because there are communities that were already leading progressive that are doing some of this work in police reform, but how do you get the communities that are stalwart and very stubborn in the fact that the way they police, they believe is right?
Sure. Well, I think the George Floyd trial, protests, conviction, and sentencing represent a tectonic shift in American attitudes toward policing. Here's what I mean. As president and CEO of the NAACP, I was in Minneapolis after Jamar Clark was killed, after Philando Castile was killed. I spent 70, 80% of my time with my colleagues flying around the country dealing with these police homicides. In each and every one of those instances, we heard things like this: if you complied, you wouldn't have died. If you obey, you won't get shot. In Ferguson, literally, we had people screaming at us in the street, pants up, don't shoot. Or pants up, won't shoot. And so in other words, the politics of policing respectability was such that any and every excuse was invoked to justify police homicide. Here we had George Floyd as an almost middle-aged Black man with an opioid addiction. His girlfriend had an opioid addiction, and America said, wait a minute, these people are like us, right? You didn't hear terms like he's a dope, he's a dope fiend, he's a crackhead, he got what he deserved because he was high. Finally, you had America see this is a Black man. Instead of, I should say, this is a human being. Instead of he's a big, ominous Black man, he was a tall Black man, a former athlete who wanted to be on the Supreme Court, right? So in other words, the narrative completely shifted. And so my point being here is we're beginning to see some cracks in that blue wall. Number one, in terms of the perception and depiction of George Floyd. Number two, you saw police officers, police brass, and rank and file stop making excuses, stop offering justifications, stop rationalizing rampant rank police brutality. In other words, this homicide was so bad, so graphic, so disgusting that you had police officers saying, we can't justify this. No, this was basically torture on tape. Right? And so my point being here is that we saw not just a shift in attitudes in terms of the public, but we saw a shift, a little bit of a shift in terms of policing. Finally, this trial demonstrated something else that I think is important for the future, which is it illustrated and demonstrated the importance of progressive prosecutors and Black prosecutors. Right? Keith Ellison came in, took charge, and said, we're not going to depend on the locals. We're not going to depend on the status quo. We're going to bring in a sophisticated, thoughtful, experienced team of prosecutors and make the case. Now, why is that important? Before coming to Harvard and before serving as CEO of the NAACP, I was a civil prosecutor in the Justice Department. And one thing I can tell you is when you have tough cases, you have to bring in people who know what they're doing, who know the law, who know the lay of the land, who know their way around a jury, know their way around a courtroom to handle a tough case. And in this case, we saw that, right? So in other words, we didn't see what happened with Breonna Taylor, right? We didn't see what happened with Michael Brown. We saw an attorney general bring in the best people to make a straightforward case instead of prosecutors essentially defending the criminal defendant.
Let me ask you this, because our show likes to also examine the media's effect on public perception.
Sure.
Where was the media helpful, harmful, and what can they do better?
Well, the media was, I think, extraordinarily helpful in terms of not only amplifying the humanity of George Floyd, that emerged over time in terms of, here's someone with a pretty significant and serious criminal record. And nevertheless, the media went beyond the rap sheet to look at the reality of the person. But then they went beyond that to literally lift up the humanity of the crowd. That was unusual, right? Let me put this, I've had a lot of experience where not only is the victim subject to a post-mortem character assassination, the crowd and the community is subject to a live character assassination. In other words, we describe the crowd as rowdy and unruly and potentially violent, and here we have essentially a compliant victim and a compliant crowd, right? And so I thought the media did a very thoughtful job of that. I thought the media did a very thoughtful job of delineating and describing the legal lay of the land, right? Just in terms of explaining to regular people, look, you might think of this as first-degree murder, but under the law, this was not charged as first-degree murder, and it was charged as manslaughter and second-degree murder. Here's the sentencing guidelines. This is what a judge can and can't do. And I thought the media did a great job of that. And I thought the media did a better job of also explaining the complexities of protests and demonstrations. Like, I've led many, and the reality is, unlike the military, moving thousands of people through the street or hundreds of people through the street, when you lead a march or a demonstration, it is always a volunteer effort. And so when you have 16, 17-year-olds, 19-year-olds leading demonstrations, it's hard for you, I think it's unfair to say, this demonstration got out of hand, therefore everybody to a person is a quote thought, a violent demonstrator. And so I thought that the media did a great job of saying there are instances of civil disturbance and violence, but in 95+% of these demonstrations, they were peaceful. And I thought the media did a really, really thoughtful job of that. Now, in terms of what the media might do better, I think the media might do a better job of looking at the institution of policing as opposed to the institutional offenses of policing. So the media does a great job of talking about carotid holes and choke holes and what's appropriate and that kind of thing and what the training is like. I thought the media could do a better job in terms of talking about what about the role of police unions? How is it that the Fraternal Order of Police till this very day has said nary a mumbling word about what happened in Minneapolis, right? So in other words, they talk about the fact that we weren't included in the negotiation of the George Floyd Act, but literally have done very little about the death of George Floyd. So meaning going behind the veil, talking about the Fraternal Order of Police, talking about the International Association of Police Chiefs. And if you notice, the Fraternal Order of Police and the police chiefs, generally speaking, on different sides of these issues. And when I was at the NAACP, I sat in the White House in a 6-hour meeting with President Obama next to the head of the Fraternal Order of Police. Now, the reason why the Obama administration put the president of the NAACP next to the head of the Fraternal Order of Police is because they have dragged their feet at every turn. It pains me to say this, but the media's got to focus on that, right? It's not just about covering how the Democrats and Republicans vote in the Senate. It's also looking at what impact do the unions have on how Democrats and Republicans vote in the Senate. I think the media has been, very thoughtful about polling, how people feel. But at the end of the day, a lot of this has to do with essentially the biggest lobby against, I should say, the biggest lobby in defense of police brutality, the Fraternal Order of Police. That I think demands a lot more media attention.
For sure. And I know you're busy, so I want to be respectful of your time. Let me ask you this. We always like to give folks a call to action. Mm-hmm. When they are listening to our guests and when they are trying to figure out in this moment, how can I be helpful? Mm-hmm. We post advocacy tools, we give folks those kinds of things. What do you tell folks? And I know, given a person in your position, I'm sure you get a lot of folks who are saying, what can I do? Right? And I appreciate you taking on that work because I know what that is like. What's the call to action to folks?
The call to action here is quite simple and quite straightforward. The first of which is maintain your presence in the streets, increase your presence in the suites and state legislatures. Okay? Let's be clear what we mean by that. I would say that there should be a rule of 10. For every 10 people that you put on the street, you should be able to put at least 1/10 the number in the suites, in the state legislatures, in the corridors of power. Meaning you can't have big demonstrations and not have big meetings with senators, with representatives, with state legislators. Number two, it's critically important for us to have our own policy agenda. What we mean by that is in your local towns, having your people, your organizations, having meetings with the city council, with the county council, with the mayors, with respect to the police budget. Not just how much it is, but where it is, right? So in other words, we've gotten to this big debate in terms of defunding the police. Well, let's note this, in Massachusetts, there was a director of youth services by the name of Jerome C. Miller. Over 30 years ago, he, a middle-aged bureaucrat, a white middle-aged bureaucrat, defunded all children's prisons. They were then called reform schools. He defunded them all. First, he depopulated the reform schools by moving children out. Then they destaffed, they defunded them. Then they destaffed them. He did that 30 years ago. They didn't call him a radical. They called him a leading, pioneering juvenile justice advocate. And Massachusetts became a model for the country. We don't have, in the main, certainly in Massachusetts, large children's prisons called reform schools, we have group homes. We did that 30 years ago. And so I've said as a professor at the Kennedy School, what Massachusetts did 30 years ago, you can do today. And what that means is it's not a matter of defunding, it's a matter of fiscally reprioritizing things that don't work in favor of things that do work. So in other words, funding public safety that does work. What we know is this: if you put police officers, if you dump police officers into schools, you don't get safer schools, you simply get more arrests, lower graduation rates. Similarly, in our communities, people can focus on that police budget in terms of making sure that police are being used for policing, and we use social workers for social work. So in other words, you can spend the same amount of money on public safety, you can even spend more, but you spend it differently. So in other words, number two, we have to make sure that people understand police budgets and how to work those budgets. Thirdly, I would simply say this: we've got to work in big coalitions. You can't have young people over here and older people over here, academics over here, and activists here. In other words, we have to put together coalitions where the people in the academy talk to the activists in the streets, who are talking to the seniors, who are also talking to young people. So in other words, as I like to teach my classes, we have to have multi-generational, multilingual, as in young, old, activist, academic language in this movement. And lastly, got to have hope, right? Why do I say that? And the example I use is, let's go back to one of the greatest abolitionists in American history. Her name was Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was enslaved. She engaged in self-abolition, freed herself, then crossed over the Mason-Dixon line time and time again and freed 70 enslaved people. Now, what I teach in my classes is, had Harriet Tubman compared the 70 people she freed to the 4 million people who were enslaved, she might have given up. In other words, she did her work not as a calculus, a realism, but really as if you will, as a result of the sum of her faith. In this moment, you got to have hope, right? In other words, you got to believe that you can bring about change. You got to organize in that way. You got to excite people, and you got to know the content. You got to know the budgets. You got to know the numbers. And so I encourage people to see the Kennedy School as a resource, right? So in other words, we have people on the faculty who work with mayors, who work with cities in terms of their budgets. And certainly the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice, which is what I lead. I mean, we work with community groups, with mayors, with police chiefs on bringing about a fundamental shift in American policing. And so I'd simply say there are things we can do.
Dr. Brooks, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. You know, we're approaching the end of Pride Month and some conflict within the LGBTQ community right here in Boston. Mass Now, Trans Resistance, the Transgender Emergency Fund, and the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition have been in conflict with Boston Pride, the group that organizes the city's largest annual parade. Now, these groups have been critical of Boston Pride for not more forcefully backing the Black Lives Matter movement and for resisting longstanding requests for more diverse leadership. Joining us in conversation is Julia Golden of Trans Resistance to talk about that and other issues. All right, Julia, so, Spark FM, I gave you a little bit of a background about what we do at the radio station and what we do here on Common Narrative. And so I want to ask you, talk to me a little bit about your organization and how it was formed.
Sure. So Trans Resistance was created last year formally. Basically, we saw around the George Floyd marches in Boston, a lot of folks understood that there was a need to really center the Black Lives Matter campaign. And as we started noticing that more and more people wanted to speak up on that behalf and talking about how Black Lives Matter, it was really important to also center Black trans lives. What we know is that Black trans women are often targeted for violence. And it was important for us to create an organization that primarily focused our attention and resources towards Black and Latinx trans women of color. On our board is a very diverse board where everything from Black, Latinx, white, trans, non-binary, cisgender, but we all have the understanding that our central goal is to lift, highlight, and promote Black trans lives.
Now, there was a little bit of controversy as you all were being formed, and this tension between Boston Pride, which has been a longtime organization operating in the city of Boston. Did you expect this conflict?
You know, I think that when we look back at the history of Boston, there's always been a very segregated city of Black and white. And I think even not as often talked about, even where Latinx people fit into that. So I think one of the interviews I did recently, I said that I think that the city of Boston is a tale of two cities. I think that this was, in my perspective, always going to come out as a problem. You know, when we talk about intersectionality, we're not just talking about LGBTQ people, we're talking about LGBTQ and how that intersects with people of color. Boston Pride has not done much to really promote LGBTQ people of color. And primarily the people on our board were part of groups that were trying to promote Latinx and Black LGBTQ people. And those opportunities were basically stripped away from them. And after that, those people decided to come together and form Trans Resistance. And I've recently joined back in February, knowing that one of the reasons I hadn't joined any LGBTQ activism efforts in Boston is primarily because I did not see their space to grow. There was no pathway to leadership for LGBTQ people of color. So I thought, why would I join efforts when people are not going to honor my energy or my ability to be an activist? And so when I saw the opportunity to volunteer with Trans Resistance, I knew this was the time. I think historically, we're going to look back and recognize how powerful of a time 2015 to 2025 is going to be when we talk about Black people, when we talk about Black trans people, as well as people of color, especially in the city of Boston. We're also just seeing the first mayor of color, and hopefully that will continue after the next election. I think that we're in a very important time in Boston as a city. So I did anticipate some of this. And I actually don't think of it so much as a controversy. I think of it as sometimes you need a disruption in the norm to understand that other people have the opportunity to lead. We've been ready to lead. We've been here leading. Me and myself, I've been leading in higher education, promoting and advocating for LGBTQ people of color for over 15 years. So I've been here as a leader. Now I feel like I can formally do that for the city of Boston.
Why do you think that there is this stoppage, this ceiling within the organization for people of color? Why does it, because you think if you're all fighting as part of this quote unquote minority group, a lot of people will think that it's more progressive than other institutions.
I think that this happens a lot, that often people pull us all in as one type of person with one type of cause, but we are not a monolith. I think that and I've been an activist for a number of years. I remember what it was like fighting along with LGBTQ people who identified as white when we fought for gay marriage. But it was interesting who decided to keep fighting and who decided to keep being an activist. I think that when it started to center around trans people of color, we started seeing some of those allies suddenly say, well, this isn't really my cause. I don't necessarily want to get married, but I thought that it was, if that's the right you want, I'll fight along your side. So I think that this is the interesting part where when we center people of color voices, suddenly people have the option to opt out. And I actually would say when Black trans women are safe and cared for and centered, we are all safe and cared for and loved. And so I think we benefit from that. And so to me, any event that highlights Black trans women, everyone will really be able to feel comfortable, and it will be an inclusive event that allows for everyone to show up. So I think that it really comes down to that a lot of people maybe took for granted the privileges that they've had. And I think we're here to disrupt that and say, that's been great, and that's amazing for you. But help us, be an activist with us, be an advocate for us, because there are still people fighting for basic rights just to live.
Do you think that this is a Boston specific problem, or is this a problem across the board?
No, if you look at what happened in Philly just the other day, Philly just made a statement where their alternative pride overthrew their Philly pride and said, this needs to center people of color, that we're actually going to ask that police not be a part of our pride. We're seeing that in New York and Brooklyn this weekend as well. So this is not just a single city having this conversation just to be divisive. It's not about that at all. You're seeing trans and queer people of color around the nation starting to say, we're here, and we've been here, and we actually want to live and be safe. And we want to have pride where it's centering our experiences.
I do want to talk about some of these issues in the trans community, people of color. I always want to say BIPOC, but I know a lot of people don't necessarily recognize that term. So I keep trying to conjugate in my head, but you understand it, obviously. And, you know, the Human Rights Watch says that the majority of just LGBTQ adults of color in the United States are facing significant mental health challenges. We know that they have housing insecurity and things like that. The transgender community, this is even more acute. And you all work in these spaces to make sure that trans folks have representation, that these outcomes are known and are being addressed. So talk to me a little bit about the scope of this problem, because I would bet my bottom dollar a lot of people don't understand how deep this goes.
Sure. Well, one of the things that Trans Resistance does do is promote the work of the Transgender Emergency Fund. We know that one of our goals is raising $250,000. We're over $110,000 to date. One of the reasons we're raising this much money is the first 20% was going towards helping to spend money around the march. But the majority of it is actually going to be going towards transgender housing in the city of Boston. That is something that we're in the talk with many different people in the city of Boston, trying to make sure that people understand, one, that transgender people do have limited options when it comes to housing. For a transgender individual, they may not have on hand proper documentation. They may not have been able to change gender or information on birth certificates and licenses and what have you. And we also know that if they came out as trans, there's a possibility and potential that they could have been thrown out from their house when coming out. These are just some of the reasons why our trans folks of color may have had a disadvantage when it comes to housing. We also know that our founders, who are very open about this, are former sex workers, are people who had to do whatever it takes to survive. And so I think what this goes back to, it's not, when we talk about things like having pride, we have to remember the history of pride was a police riot, was people of color and people in socioeconomic class that said, we want to be treated and humanized. So I think that we're back at that place again, where it's people saying, you might be arguing to have fun programs. We literally need these resources so that we can survive and get by day to day. And so some of these health disparities, as you mentioned, mental health, imagine not having proper resources or basic items to survive. That does take a toll on your mental health. So I think it's really important that we not only raise money, but that we raise, as you said, awareness about what some trans people of color may be experiencing. And again, it's not a monolith. Some trans people of color don't need these resources in the same way, right? But for those who do, we want to make sure that the education is out there and that we show that we are fundraising and doing our best to provide those resources.
How difficult is it to have the trans conversation in communities of color? Because that has got to also be a really hard barrier as well.
Oh, absolutely. I think as someone who, as an educator and someone who has created trans and queer people of color trainings regarding LGBTQ and safe zone trainings for college and institutions, I'm the first one to do that on a national basis. And the reason I'm the first person to do that is, one, we have to acknowledge that most trans and queer people of color don't have access to college education. Some do, but I'm a doctoral student right now, and I always say it's a miracle I'm at this point. I'm at UMass Boston right now, and I refer to myself and other trans queer people of color as unicorns, because it is a miracle and magical that we have made it this far in our education. But the other part of this is that we really have to recognize that culturally, a lot of our communities, where, I think in the Latinx community, it's very much in the binary gender-wise. These conversations are really hard to have. And I don't necessarily, I'm always careful when I say sometimes spirituality and spiritual beliefs can also play a part in some of the conversations around being trans and LGBTQ. I don't necessarily want to assume that's always the case though, but for a lot of times, it also is about representation. How many people of color know a trans person of color? They, a lot of times I'm the first non-binary person of color they've ever met. And that can be either they're interested in learning or they're very nervous, or maybe I'm a threat. And I've had to have a lot of patience over the years to explain, this is who I am, love it or leave it. But I think for me, I rather meet people where they're at, so that at least when you meet with me, you're willing to learn more about what it means to be transgender, non-binary. I don't have the lived experience as transgender. I can talk about the non-binary experience, but I can certainly give you data and statistics. And I'm a huge advocate for trans rights. And so I rather that people feel safe with me around that conversation. But I think it's important for us to also acknowledge that none of us owe anyone that story, right? So I think with respect, we can have those conversations, but it is tricky. And I think for me, I'm understanding as an educator, not everyone knows how to have these conversations with trans people of color and with their own culture. I always remind people too, sometimes we're choosing our queerness or transness over our culture, over our languages, over our people. And we never wanted to do that. And when I kind of let people know about that, people are like, wow, I never really thought of the fact that you're giving this up just so you can be who you are. So that's kind of another narrative I like to suggest. At least that's my story. But I think it's important that people understand sometimes we sacrifice a lot just to be ourselves.
So how do you have the conversation? How do you broach this? There might be some folks who are conflicted about this, watching and listening to today's program.
Sure. Yeah. I think that the best thing I can do is, I'm a storyteller by nature. I offer my story, my information, it's all on social media. I think that's something I'm very open about. And I think that Trans Resistance, we try to offer lots of resources and information as well. We often have not just a website, but we often give out links and educational links and resources so that the community can grow and learn with us. Again, I recognize not everybody is going to understand what we're about or why we're doing it. But I think at some point, for me, this is something that, if you ask me down the bottom line, is I believe everyone has the right to feel safe and have a home and has the right to live. And it goes down to those values for me. And I think that includes all people. So I think that I want to center the conversation around trans people of color, because a lot of violence is happening to those groups of individuals. And so to me, trans Black women specifically, because of how they are being targeted, that means to me we have the most work to do to advocate for them.
One of the things that we do here on Common Narrative is really break down the media's effect on public perception around these really deep issues. In what ways has the media helped and or harmed the work that folks like yourself are doing?
Sure. I think right now, we're starting to see a turn in the media in the past 5 years. Everything when you see FX Pose, that series has talked a lot about ballroom culture. Now, not every trans person of color is coming from that background, but sometimes it has done a lot to explain some people's histories, culture, kind of slang around that, but also humanizing characters that have multiple layers to their story. So I think you're starting to see on media many more trans actresses and actors, artists, singers, a lot more people coming out as non-binary. I believe Demi Lovato just came out as non-binary. So we're starting to see this go, I don't want to say mainstream yet, But I want to say that the media is starting to show that this is a little bit more happening more often than maybe we assumed. And in that case, I think sometimes if you're in the middle of nowhere and all you have is access to television and internet, and you're starting to see this populate in the media as not necessarily negative, but just, oh, these folks are out there, they're living, they exist. That kind of starts a narrative of the questions for people, or that starts at least for people to understand, oh, these are characters that are represented. This is something that happens, there is. And I think that at least right now, I think we're seeing a lot more positive media. I think that I will say, as someone who is a millennial, a lot in the early 2000s and 90s, a lot of media showed more violence, showed a lot more stereotypes as transgender individuals. So I think that we're getting to a place where it's more complex characters with multiple layers that I appreciate.
I imagine things around language, though, still remain a problem. Like, you mentioned Demi Lovato, and I immediately thought about the issue on one of the other radio stations with the shock jock there, right? And
Right.
so I immediately thought of even experiences in my newsroom at Channel 25, where we have to take a second to be more careful about pronouns. And
Yes.
that's just like an extra layer of awareness that I think newsrooms
Sure.
and the media writ large are getting used to, right? And it's like,
Sure.
and I imagine that coming up against that and having to be the person that always has to be like, hey, you need to make sure you're being thoughtful about pronouns is also exhausting, right? And then being a person of color on top of that.
Oh, yes. I mean, this is emotional labor. And one of the things I actually specifically study in my doctoral work is secondary trauma, student professional affairs of color. So basically saying that what happens a lot in education, at least for folks, when we work in education, we're always working and helping our students out. We're also having to navigate our own identities. And over time, you get exposed to various forms of traumas. Therefore, you end up getting compassion fatigue and burnout. So these things take emotional labor. And I think people need to understand when we talk about things like microaggressions, a lot of times people have this idea of you're being too sensitive. But when you look at Boston University and some of the ways they've done mapping of microaggressions of the brain and seeing how it reacts, when you look at some of the research on racial battle fatigue, what you're going to notice is a lot of research is now starting to show how these quick insults and discriminatory comments add up and physiologically change your body. We react physiologically to discrimination. And there's plenty of research out there. I would say, Dr. William Smith is someone who advocates and talks a lot about this in his research. But I think it's important to highlight that because you're absolutely correct. It does take a toll. I have chosen this as my volunteer work because I believe in it. And I also rather someone ask me rather than a Black trans woman all the time, I can take on that labor in honor of them, and that's fine. But I do think at some point, you're correct. Should we always have to be advocating and saying, please use the right pronouns, please? It's tiring. It is. But I think in this role, that's my job and that's my honor.
We always like to leave folks with some call to action, some advocacy work. What can someone who's listening, watching this right now do to be better advocates, allies, accomplices
Sure.
to the work that you're doing?
I think the thing I always ask people, if they're uncomfortable with this conversation, reflect, ask yourself why. Because sometimes is it something that's based on not understanding? And what are you trying to understand? Is there resources that you need to look up? If this isn't just, I know sometimes it sounds kind of a little like shady, like I'm throwing shade, but sometimes Google has amazing resources that if I'm just trying to understand pronouns, just Googling that, there are some amazing resources that people have put together to explain not only the history, but what happens when you make a mistake. I think a lot of times we're so scared to learn about people that we don't even try to start the conversation. And so even if go to Trans Resistance and go to our website, go to our Instagram and our Facebook, you'll see that we give little bits of information as to what the work that we're doing, but also explain why we're doing it. So I think reflecting, sitting with these things and thinking, why is this important? Asking yourself that. And I think just learning about housing insecurity. That's not just about trans people of color. That's about everybody. Every family is one paycheck away from being housing insecure. I do a lot of work on food and financial security for colleges and universities. And so just learning about that topic is a way of self-educating. But I think we can't be afraid to self-educate, because that's when we become ignorant, and discrimination is grown from ignorance. And so that to me is my biggest suggestion, is just be willing to learn. I'm not asking you to agree. I'm not even asking, because that's up to you, but be willing to learn and just hear some of these stories, and maybe you'll find something in it that you can relate to. I think that's the best I can do. And I would definitely say, if you're willing to support the Transgender Emergency Fund, we still have about $140,000 we're trying to raise. And that goes to primarily making sure that Black trans women of color have the opportunity for housing in the city of Boston.
Julia Golden, thank you so much for taking some time. I know it's a busy month, a busy time for you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks to Reverend Brooks and Golden for taking some time with us. And don't forget to check out our advocacy tools on commonnarrative.media and rewatch any of this episode or any of our shows on Facebook and YouTube. And remember, knowledge is power and power is change. We'll see you next time.